Okay, let's dive deep into a really complex situation. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We hear a lot about the politics, the military stuff, the religious angles.
Right, the headlines tend to focus there.
Exactly. But the sources you've brought us today, they point us towards some less discussed dimensions, really crucial ones.
Things like population dynamics, surprisingly wide economic effects from the recent war,
Hmm.
and how land itself, planning it, owning it, is core to the struggle.
Yeah, absolutely central. So our mission here is to kind of extract the key insights from this material, give you a shortcut to understanding these, well, these really significant aspects.
That's good. Where should we start?
Let's get our bearings first. A quick look at the history. Because the sources are clear, this isn't new. It goes back, what, over a century. Competing claims for statehood.
That's vital context, yeah. The sources really trace it back to the British Mandate period, after World War I. Ottoman Empire breaks up.
And British policies, plus increasing Jewish immigration back then, started shifting the population balance quite dramatically, didn't they?
They did. It really set the stage for everything that came after World War II.
Like the 1947 UN partition plan. Proposed two states, divide the land. But that didn't quite work out.
No, it wasn't fully implemented,
Yeah.
led straight into more conflict. Then Israel declared independence in May 48.
Triggering the first Arab-Israeli war, and by the time the fighting stopped in 49, the map looked very different.
Very different. And the sources really emphasize the human cost of that 48 war.
The Palestinian exodus, the Nakba, the catastrophe.
Over 700,000 refugees displaced, and the UN called for the return later, Resolution 194.
Which becomes the central point, the right of return demand for Palestinians.
Fast forward a bit, 1967, the Six-Day War.
A decisive Israeli victory, resulting in the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, other areas too.
Fundamentally changed the situation on the ground, created the reality of occupation we still discuss constantly today.
And from that, UN Security Council Resolution 242, introducing that core concept, land for peace.
The idea being Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the 67 war in exchange for peace, for recognition.
But despite that framework, peace efforts, well, they've struggled. The sources mention things like the Oslo Accords in the 90s.
Yeah, aimed for Palestinian self-governance in phases. But, never reached that final agreement, fell short.
And this history isn't ancient. The sources point out the years leading right up to late 2023 saw escalating violence. 2022 was reportedly the deadliest year since 2005.
So yeah, this long, often tragic history is the essential backdrop for everything else.
Okay, so let's shift to one of those less discussed dynamics the sources highlight. Demography. Copulation. It's not just counting heads, is it? It's seen as strategic. Strength in numbers.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is how the sources suggest these population trends aren't just observed, they're sometimes seen as political tools or pressure points.
So what are the current numbers? Early 2024 figures mentioned in the sources.
Roughly, Israel at about 9.9 million people. The Palestinian territory, around 5.4 million.
Okay, but those raw numbers don't tell the whole story, right? The sources dig into density, especially on arable land.
That's where it gets really stark. Israel's already dense. 2,599 people per square kilometer of potential farmland. Compare that to the EU average, like 620.
Wow. And the Palestinian territory.
It's incredible, 13,126, more than 5 times denser than Israel on that usable land. Immense pressure on resources.
And historically, how did these numbers shift?
Well, under the British Mandate, the Jewish population share jumped significantly from 11% to 32% between 22 and 48, partly immigration.
Supported by British policy, yeah.
Then after 48, within Israel, more immigration boosted Jewish numbers rapidly. At the same time, as we said, the Nakba, the displacement of many Palestinians.
But looking at the total population, Israel plus Palestine, the sources talk about this trend, this Palestinian numerical overtaking.
Yeah, growth rates. In the roughly 20 years before 2021, 2022, Israel's population grew 72.4%, but Palestine's grew faster, 87.8%.
And the projection.
They continue that trend. Sources project that across the whole territory, the Jewish population share, which was about 48% in 2022, could drop to around 45% by 2048.
So what's driving that difference? Why the faster Palestinian growth, which the sources say causes concern in Israel?
2 main things highlighted in the sources: fertility rates and age structure. Palestinian women average about 3.6 children. Israeli women, 2.8.
Okay.
And crucially, the Palestinian population is much younger. 38% under 15 compared to 28% in Israel.
Meaning more people entering childbearing age soon, higher built-in growth potential.
Exactly. That's the dynamic. And the sources even flag potential internal issues for Israel, like the higher fertility among some more extremist minority groups, possibly making peace harder down the road.
So these numbers are far from static. They're seen as having real long-term political weight.
Absolutely. And, while we're on population, we have to mention the human cost of the conflict, which obviously impacts these numbers directly and tragically.
The casualties reported since October 2023.
Yes, Palestinian sources report devastating figures by late 2024. Over 43,000 casualties in Gaza, 700 plus in the West Bank, plus 10,000 missing, half children and women. It's a terrible reality behind the statistics.
A vital, sobering point. Okay, so demography is one strategic layer. Let's shift to another the sources say is fundamental: planning and land ownership. Not just bees, but how these are used in what's called a continual struggle for ownership.
This is where the sources offer some really deep insights. They argue property formation itself is key to settler colonialism. It's used to assert belonging, collective identity for the incoming group.
While erasing or undermining existing claims.
Precisely. It's about forging this deep connection to the land for one group and controlling who else gets to have that connection or even basic rights on the land.
And this goes back to post-1948 again.
Yes. The sources detail how Palestinian land was nationalized, became Israel lands. And the key point, managed for exclusive Jewish settlement and development.
Exclusive. And the result today?
93% of the territory inside 1948 Israel is now Israel lands. And you generally can't buy or sell it. It's state-controlled for that purpose.
And planning, the whole system of zoning and permits, is tied into this.
Deeply interwoven, according to the sources. They even identify land Judaization as an explicit planning objective in some contexts. So planning isn't neutral. It's presented as a tool.
The case studies really bring this home. Let's talk about the Kamana case, a Bedouin family on land they actually owned privately.
Right. But despite owning the land, they face severe marginalization. Planning decisions, zoning issues, a greenbelt designation effectively blocked them from getting legal recognition for their homes.
So they couldn't build legally.
Couldn't build legally, couldn't
Excellent.
connect to basic infrastructure, roads, water, sewage, electricity, essentially isolated on their own property.
So the source uses this to show property isn't just the title deed, it's the rights that usually come with it: dwelling, building, services. And those rights were denied through planning.
Exactly. It controls how you can actually live on the land.
Then there's the Lydda case, a city transformed after 48. Expulsions, expropriations.
Yeah, and the sources contrast the development there. A Jewish neighborhood, Gani Aviv, built with full services for immigrants.
Including Russian immigrants who boosted the settler numbers.
Right. Compared to internally displaced Palestinians in another neighborhood, Pardes Nur, they owned their land parcels.
But couldn't build legally.
Blocked by planning regulations, which forced them into building what gets labeled illegal structures on their own land.
And the sources mention segregation too, explicitly or implicitly.
They report instances of segregation in housing access, neighbor objections based on, racializing arguments about who belongs where, potential impacts on property values, neighborhood character.
And the sources link this pattern, denying rights via planning, unequal enforcement, segregation, to what one source calls the crystallization of apartheid, using seemingly neutral processes to control space and rights based on identity.
So these cases illustrate how planning and land ownership are really powerful strategic tools in this ongoing struggle over who belongs, who has rights, who controls the landscape.
Okay, so history, demography, land control. Now let's widen the lens again. The sources talk about surprising global economic ripples from the recent war, things you might not expect.
Yeah, it's important to remember this conflict didn't happen in an economic bubble. It hit a global economy already stressed by trade wars, the pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war.
Added another layer of shock.
Exactly. More uncertainty, more instability.
So how did it specifically impact the global economy, according to these sources? Financial markets first.
Well, uncertainty about escalation made investors nervous. They reduced exposure, particularly in the Middle East, moved money into safer assets, gold, U.S. Treasury bonds.
Causing volatility.
Yeah, you saw it reflected in things like the VIX index, the fear gauge spiking. Erodes confidence.
And energy prices. Obviously a big one, given the Middle East supplies, over 60%?
Right. Oil prices jumped above $90 a barrel initially. But the bigger risk highlighted is escalation. If the conflict spread, disrupting major producers or shipping.
Prices could go much higher.
The sources mentioned projections, potentially $150, $200, even more per barrel in really severe scenarios. Significant global impact.
Tourism in the region took a big hit too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
Immediately. Israel saw something like a 75% drop in tourism and air travel late 2023.
Huge losses.
Huge. Contributes to projections of the regional economy shrinking significantly, maybe from around $246 billion a year down towards $150 billion. Canceled flights, empty hotels.
And insurance costs went up.
Yes. Partly destruction on the ground, but hugely amplified by the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. Marine war insurance premiums for ships going through there just soared.
How much?
Up to 0.7% of the ship's value per trip. For a big vessel, that's over $800,000 extra, just for insurance.
Wow. And those Red Sea attacks obviously mess with supply chains too.
Big time. You've got crucial choke points there. Suez Canal, Strait of Hormuz. When the Red Sea route became too dangerous, ships had to reroute.
Longer trips, more expensive.
Much longer, around Africa. More expensive. The Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, which measures this stress, jumped after October 2023. Further escalation means more disruption, maybe scarcity, imported inflation globally.
And just generally, businesses felt the pinch.
Yeah, higher operating costs, energy, insurance, shipping, but also that general uncertainty. It makes businesses pause, delay investments, hold off on hiring. That has a chilling effect.
Okay, now this next point from the sources is fascinating. Unexpected. The inflation spillover.
Right. So interestingly, Israel's own inflation reportedly declined, wartime monetary policy, but neighboring countries often saw their inflation increase.
But it went further than neighbors.
This is the surprising part. The source's correlation analysis suggests Israel's inflation rate had strong positive links, potential spillovers, to inflation in countries far away, like places like Japan, New Zealand, China, France, Germany, South Africa, the UK. It suggests this complex web of connection, maybe through those shared global energy or supply chain pressures we talked about, a regional conflict potentially nudging price levels continents away.
Amazing. And the sources also mention the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, obviously, and other impacts reaching Africa and Europe.
Yeah, the effects ripple out in many different economic and political ways.
So, wrapping this up, it's clear from this dive into the sources that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, well, it's incredibly multi-layered, way beyond the daily headlines. We've seen how population trends are strategic, the strength in numbers idea, how planning and owning land isn't just paperwork, it's a core part of the struggle shaping actual lives.
And how events there can unexpectedly ripple outwards, affecting global markets, supply chains, maybe even the prices you pay far away.
It really underscores the need to look deeper, beyond the immediate news, at these historical, demographic, economic forces the sources bring to light.
Absolutely. Which leaves us with a big question, really. Something for you, the listener, to think about.
Yeah.
Given everything we've discussed, the powerful influence of these demographic shifts, the strategic use of land and planning that the sources detail, how might these deep-seated factors fundamentally change the prospects for finding, well, any kind of path towards coexistence or resolution in the future?